Most people assume that if you work around UFO investigations long enough, you eventually end up believing you found the answer. That wasn't my experience. My name is Sean Ramsey. Between 2001 and 2012, I worked as a government contractor in New Mexico. My job wasn't particularly glamorous, wasn't a pilot or scientist. I never worked at Area 51, never handled alien bodies, and never stood inside a hangar looking at a recovered spacecraft. Most of my time was spent sitting in offices. I reviewed reports, interviewed witnesses, I compared statements. I helped organize records that had accumulated over decades from different agencies, departments, and contractors. Sometimes that meant driving a few hours to speak with somebody who claimed they'd seen something unusual. Sometimes it meant spending an entire week sorting through boxes of paperwork that nobody had touched since the 1970s. The work was a lot less exciting sometimes than people imagine. When most people think about UFO investigations, they picture classified briefings, secret technology, and armed guards standing outside steel doors. The reality was usually more mundane. Most reports turned out to be aircraft. Some were satellites. Some were weather balloons. Some were simply people misidentifying ordinary things in the sky. A surprising number involved people who were looking for attention. By the time I'd been doing the job for a few years, I had developed a fairly healthy level of skepticism. If someone called claiming they'd seen a spacecraft hovering over their property, I generally assumed there was an explanation we simply hadn't found yet. More often than not, that assumption turned out to be correct. That's one of the reasons I get frustrated when people talk about UFO investigations as though every report is some enormous mystery. Most aren't. Most cases die quickly. A witness makes a report, somebody investigates it, additional information turns up, and the case gets closed. That's the normal process. But there were exceptions. I had my own list. Some involved civilians, scientists, military personnel. None of them became famous. If you spent any time around UFO discussions, you probably heard the names that always come up. Bob Lazar, Art Bell, the various military pilots whose stories became public years later. Those names were discussed constantly in UFO circles. Every conference, every radio show, every online discussion eventually seemed to circle back to those same handful of cases. The reports that stayed with me weren't those ones. In fact, most people have never heard of the individuals involved in the cases I'm about to describe. There were no documentaries made about them, no best-selling books, no TV specials. For the most part, the people involved lived ordinary lives and wanted nothing to do with public attention. Some actively avoided it. Others agreed to interviews only because they believed someone should document what had happened to them. Over the years, I spoke with hundreds of witnesses. Most of those conversations faded from memory. A few didn't. I still remember where some of them took place. I remember the offices, the conference rooms. I remember stacks of folders sitting on metal desks, audio recordings playing through cheap speakers, handwritten statements from people trying their best to describe something they didn't fully understand. What I remember most clearly is the consistency. Not in every case, but in certain ones. Sometimes a witness would describe an event, and months later I'd encounter another report from a completely different person describing something remarkably similar. Then I'd find an older file containing details that matched both accounts. Most of the time there was reasonable explanation. Sometimes there wasn't. And that's where these stories come from. They aren't the most famous reports you've ever heard of. They're simply the ones that stayed with me. I don't claim to know what happened in any of these cases. I don't claim they prove anything. The only thing I can tell you is that I reviewed the reports myself. I spoke with the people involved whenever possible. I read the statements, compared the timelines, and I looked for explanations. I really did. In each case, I came away with more questions than answers. And even now, years later, I still think about them. These are the reports I never managed to explain. Story 1. Now, the first report comes out of Socorro, New Mexico. I first read it in 2004 while reviewing older witness statements that had been pulled for comparison against a separate case. At the time, I wasn't looking for anything unusual. The file wasn't marked as important, wasn't part of a classified program, wasn't connected to military personnel or restricted facilities. It was just a civilian report. The primary witness was a man named Robert Anderson. He lived with his wife, Karen, on a small property several miles outside town. The area wasn't isolated enough to be considered remote, but it was far enough from the highway that nights were usually quiet. A few neighboring homes sat scattered across the surrounding land, separated by long stretches of open desert. The original report began on the evening of May 14, 1998. According to Robert's statement, he stepped outside shortly after 10 o'clock to lock a storage shed behind his house. While crossing the yard, he noticed an unusually bright light above a ridge west of the property. At first, he assumed it was an aircraft. That wasn't unusual for the area. People reported seeing military aircraft, helicopters, and other lights moving across the sky. Robert initially paid little attention to it. What caught his interest was the fact that it didn't appear to be moving. The light remained fixed in the exact same position for several minutes. Then it disappeared. Not gradually, or behind the clouds, not over the horizon. According to Robert, it simply vanished. He stood in the yard for another minute, trying to determine where it had gone. Before he could figure it out, a second light appeared farther south. This one remained visible for less than 30 seconds, before disappearing as well. Robert eventually went back inside and thought little of it. The following morning, he mentioned the lights to his wife. That conversation became important later because Karen independently reported seeing the same thing. She'd been looking through a kitchen window while cleaning dishes and noticed an unusually bright light beyond the ridge. At the time, she assumed it was a helicopter. Only after speaking with Robert the next morning did she realize that they'd both observed the same event. Now, under normal circumstances, the report probably would have ended there. People see strange lights all the time. The problem was that Robert and Karen weren't the only witnesses. 3 days after the initial report, a deputy reviewing recent calls noticed another statement from the same evening. The witness was a neighboring property owner named Kevin Wallace. Kevin lived approximately 2 miles north of the Anderson residence. Unlike Robert and Karen, Kevin didn't report a hovering light. He reported several lights. His statement described 3 bright objects appearing above the western horizon shortly after 10 o'clock. According to Kevin, the lights remained stationary for several minutes before disappearing individually. The times listed in his statement closely matched the Anderson report, and that was enough to generate additional interest. A deputy contacted all 3 witnesses separately and conducted follow-up interviews. The purpose was simple. Investigators wanted to determine whether the witnesses had discussed the event among themselves before making their statements. The answer appeared to be no. Robert Anderson didn't know Kevin Wallace personally. Kevin Wallace had never spoken to Karen Anderson. The witnesses lived in the same general area, but there was no evidence they had coordinated their reports. What stood out wasn't just the agreement, it was the level of detail. Each witness independently described the lights as unusually bright, but difficult to estimate in size. Each placed them above roughly the same section of the horizon. Each reported that the lights remained stationary before disappearing suddenly. There were minor differences, but the core observations matched. The file might still have ended there, if not for a 4th witness. About 2 weeks later, investigators located a utility worker who'd been servicing equipment in the area on the same night. His name wasn't highlighted anywhere in the report. He wasn't treated as a major witness. In fact, he initially dismissed the entire subject when contacted. Only after reviewing his work records did investigators realize he'd been parked along a service road less than 3 miles from the Anderson property during the time of the sighting. When interviewed, he admitted seeing unusual lights that evening, and his description matched the others again. By itself, none of this was particularly extraordinary. The sky is full of things people misidentify. Aircraft lights can appear stationary under certain conditions. Atmospheric effects can distort distances. Human memory is notoriously unreliable. Those explanations were all considered. The problem was that investigators never found evidence supporting any of them. No aircraft operating in the area matched the reported positions. No weather events were recorded. No military exercises accounted for the sightings. The case eventually remained classified as unexplained. Now, when I first reviewed the file years later, that wasn't what interested me. What interested me was what happened afterward. One of the things investigators occasionally do with older reports is conduct follow-up interviews. The goal is partly to verify information, and partly to see how memories change over time. Memories almost always change. People add detail, people remove details, stories evolve. This isn't necessarily dishonesty, it's simply how memory works. I'm sure it's happened to you. Years pass, details blur, people unconsciously fill in gaps. By the time I reviewed the Anderson file, more than 6 years had passed since the original event. I expected the witness accounts to have drifted significantly. They hadn't. Robert Anderson's account was almost identical to the statement he'd given in 1998. Karen Anderson's account remained remarkably consistent as well. Even small details stayed the same. The order in which the lights appeared, the direction they occupied, the approximate duration of the sightings. The same was true for Kevin Wallace. The consistency wasn't perfect, but it was far better than I normally encountered. And that got my attention, so I continued digging through the file. Eventually, I discovered that another investigator had done exactly the same thing several years earlier. His notes were included near the back of the folder. One sentence stood out. The investigator wrote, "Witness credibility remains high due to unusual consistency across multiple interviews conducted over extended periods." Now, that wasn't language investigators used casually. It didn't mean the witnesses were correct. It simply meant they appeared very sincere. And sincerity matters. A witness can be completely honest and still be mistaken, don't get me wrong. What bothered me was that nobody could identify what they'd actually seen. The report had been reviewed repeatedly. Various explanations had been proposed. None survived scrutiny. Wasn't aircraft, wasn't astronomical objects, wasn't known military activity. The file eventually reached a point where investigators simply stopped working it. There was nowhere left to go. The witnesses had said everything they could say. The evidence had been examined repeatedly. No new information emerged, and the case was never solved. Years later, shortly before I left the program, I reviewed the Anderson file one final time. I remember sitting in a small office surrounded by stacks of records, flipping through the same witness statements that had been written more than a decade earlier. Nothing had changed. The conclusions and the questions were the same. The explanations were still missing. And that's why I remember the case. Not because it proved aliens, not because it involved extraordinary evidence, because it represented something I encountered repeatedly throughout my career. A group of ordinary people witnessed something they couldn't explain. Investigators spent years trying to explain it, and despite every effort, the answer never arrived. The Anderson file remained unresolved when I first read it. It remained unresolved when I retired, and as far as I know, it remains unresolved today. Story 2. The second report came from Los Alamos. Unlike the Anderson file, I wasn't reviewing old records when I first encountered it. This case came to me through an interview. The primary witness was a retired scientist named Justin Lee. I met him in 2007. At the time, he'd been retired for several years, now was living outside Albuquerque. The interview itself wasn't supposed to focus on a UFO sighting. I was reviewing a collection of older reports involving government facilities throughout New Mexico, and Justin's name appeared repeatedly in the supporting documentation. Most of the individuals connected to those reports had either passed away or declined to speak with investigators. Justin agreed almost immediately. That surprised me. People tend to assume scientists are eager to discuss unusual experiences. In reality, many are quite the opposite. The professional consequences of being associated with UFO reports can be significant. Even when a witness is completely sincere, many prefer to avoid the subject entirely. Justin wasn't concerned about any of that. When I arrived at his home, he greeted me at the front door, led me to a small office, and spent the first 20 minutes explaining why most UFO reports were completely nonsense. He wasn't hostile. He simply believed most cases had ordinary explanations. Aircraft, weather, misidentification, faulty observations. By the end of that conversation, I was fairly certain the interview wouldn't produce anything particularly interesting. And then I asked him about a report from 1983. The change was immediate. For the first time during the interview, he stopped talking. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the report number written on my notes. After several seconds, he nodded. Then he said, "That's the one people keep asking about." The report involved a sighting near a restricted area outside Los Alamos. No photographs or video or radar confirmation existed. At first glance, the file appeared surprisingly weak. The reason it attracted attention wasn't because of the evidence, it was because of the witnesses. According to the report, several employees observed an unusual object over a restricted section of land during the same afternoon. The sighting lasted only a few minutes. Nobody claimed the object landed, nobody claimed it interacted with them, and nobody reported extraordinary behavior. The object simply remained visible long enough for multiple people to observe it. Then it was gone. Now, on paper, that doesn't sound particularly impressive. Thousands of UFO reports contained similar claims. What made this one different was what happened afterward. As part of the original investigation, each witness was interviewed separately. That wasn't unusual. Investigators generally prefer independent statements because witnesses influence one another very easily. People discuss events, memories get shared, details migrate from one account to another. Independent statements are usually far more valuable. In this case, there were 6 primary witnesses. Justin Lee was one of them. The others included scientists, technicians, and administrative personnel working in different parts of the facility. According to the original investigator, the witnesses had little opportunity to coordinate their accounts before being interviewed, and that part became important later. When I reviewed the statements myself, I understood why. The descriptions were remarkably similar. Each witness described a bright object, a metallic appearance, and said the object was stationary. Several used nearly identical language when discussing its shape. Now again, that doesn't necessarily prove anything. The problem was that the consistency extended beyond the basic observations. Witnesses agreed on smaller details as well. The approximate duration, the direction, the lighting conditions, the apparent altitude. Even the sequence of events matched closely from statement to statement. I'd reviewed enough reports by that point to understand how rare that is. Normally, witness accounts become less consistent as additional detail is introduced. This case moved in the opposite direction. The more detail investigators requested, the more the accounts aligned. If 6 people disagree about what they saw, investigators can begin identifying errors and misunderstandings. Agreement is much more difficult, especially when nobody can explain the object itself. Justin told me that several investigators spent years attempting to find a conventional explanation for the sighting. Aircraft records, weather records, military activity were all examined. And one by one, they were eliminated. Eventually, the case stalled. No new evidence appeared. No additional witnesses came forward. The file entered storage like thousands of others. That should have been the end of it. Instead, investigators kept returning to it. The reason wasn't the object, it was the statements. Every few years, somebody would pull the file and review it again. Then another investigator would do the same. The pattern repeated for decades. Near the end of my interview, I asked Justin a question that had been bothering me for most of the afternoon. I asked him whether he believed the object was extraterrestrial. He laughed immediately. It's probably the strongest reaction I got from him all day. And then he shook his head and said, "I don't know." He simply accepted that he didn't know what he'd seen. I never discovered what Justin Lee and the others observed that afternoon. Neither did the investigators who reviewed the case before me. And as far as I know, nobody ever found an answer. Story 3. The third report came from White Sands Missile Range. I didn't discover it because somebody told me to look at it. I discovered it because the same file kept appearing. When you spend years reviewing reports, you began noticing certain case numbers, the way a mechanic notices a strange sound in an engine. Most reports pass through the system once and they disappear forever. A witness gives a statement, an investigator reviews it, a conclusion is reached, the file gets archived. This one didn't. The primary witness was a retired military pilot named Phil Jenkins. The original incident occurred in April of 1991. According to flight records, Phil was participating in a routine training exercise west of White Sands Missile Range during a clear afternoon. The weather documentation attached to the file was almost boring in its normality. Visibility exceeded 30 miles, winds were light, no storms had been recorded anywhere in the region. The sky should have made observation very easy, and that's one of the reasons investigators paid attention to the report. According to Phil's statement, he first noticed the object because of a reflection. At first, he assumed another aircraft had caught the sun at the right angle. Pilots see that constantly. A flash appears, you look toward it. A moment later, you identify the aircraft responsible. This didn't happen. The reflection appeared again several seconds later. Then again. Phil adjusted his heading slightly and focused on the area. And that was when he saw the object itself. The original description was surprisingly detailed. He described it as a dark oval shape suspended above the desert landscape. No wings or visible tail section, no rotors, no contrail, no exhaust plume, nothing suggesting conventional flight. The object appeared smooth, featureless, almost simple. Years later, when I interviewed Phil, he told me something that never made it into the original report. He said the object looked strangely isolated. At first, I didn't understand what he meant, and then he explained. He told me that most aircraft exist within a context. You see movement, distance, background references. Even if you can't identify what you're looking at, you can usually understand how it relates to the surrounding environment. This object felt detached from everything around it. It wasn't moving across the sky, it wasn't circling or climbing, wasn't descending. It simply occupied a fixed position above the desert. The area beneath it consisted of empty terrain, dry earth, scattered brush, a series of low ridges extending toward distant mountains. Nothing else. The object appeared to be hanging over emptiness. The report estimated that Phil observed it for approximately 40 seconds before contacting ground control. The radio transcript survived. I read it myself, and there was no excitement in his voice or panic, no attempt to sensationalize what he was seeing. He simply reported an unidentified object and requested confirmation. Ground control acknowledged the transmission and began checking radar coverage. Phil continued observing. The object remained stationary. Every few seconds, sunlight flashed across part of its surface. Those reflections appeared repeatedly throughout the documentation. Several investigators specifically commented on them. The flashes weren't constant. They came and went. Bright silver, then gone. Bright silver again, then gone. Like sunlight striking polished metal from a changing angle. The object itself remained dark. The reflections were the only detail that seemed to change. And then the object just vanished. According to Phil's statement, one moment the object occupied a fixed position in the sky. The next moment it was gone. The airspace appeared empty. Under ordinary circumstances, that probably would have ended the investigation. Witnesses lose sight of objects constantly. Distance estimates are difficult. Visual observations are imperfect, and investigators understand that. The radar records complicated things, though. Ground personnel documented an unidentified return in roughly the same area at approximately the same time. The return wasn't strong enough to identify, wasn't tracked for long. It wasn't sufficient evidence to determine exactly what had been detected, but it existed. And that meant investigators now had two separate sources of information: a pilot observation and a radar return. Now, neither proved anything, but together, they were enough to keep the case open. Most reports eventually reach a dead end. This one should have. Instead, an investigator reviewing historical records made an interesting discovery. Phil Jenkins wasn't the first pilot to file a report from that area. Several years earlier, another military pilot had reported an unidentified object in nearly the same section of airspace. The file contained copies of both reports. I remember placing them side by side on a desk while reviewing the case. Different dates and witnesses, different investigators, similar descriptions. Both men described dark objects. Both described the same reflections, and both described stationary observations. Both lost visual contact while clearly observing the object's departure. And that discovery generated additional interest. Investigators expanded their search, and eventually they found a third report, then a fourth. None of the reports were identical. That would have been suspicious. Human beings describe things differently. But the similarities appeared in the broad details: dark shape, occasional reflections, stationary observation, brief duration. No obvious explanation. The oldest report dated back to the late 1970s. The newest was filed years after Phil's sighting. Different pilots and aircraft, different weather conditions. Yet the descriptions continued appearing, again and again. One pilot compared the object to a smooth river stone suspended in the sky. Another described it as an oval silhouette against the horizon. A third wrote that it appeared like a dark seed hanging motionless above the desert. The language varied. The image remained remarkably similar. And that was what kept drawing investigators back. Not one report, the pattern. By the time I interviewed Phil in 2008, he was already aware of the other sightings. Somebody had informed him years earlier. I asked whether that changed his perspective, and he nodded. "I was relieved," he said. I asked why, and he explained that for years he assumed the incident had been a mistake, a visual error or misidentification, something explainable that he simply hadn't figured out. Learning about the other reports didn't provide answers, but it did convince him he wasn't alone. As I continued reviewing the records, I noticed another pattern. The reports tended to originate from roughly the same region. Not exactly the same coordinates or precisely the same location, but the same general area. A section of desert that on paper appeared completely unremarkable. No unusual structures, no restricted facilities connected to the reports, nothing investigators could point toward as an obvious explanation. Just empty desert. And that fact bothered several investigators. I found handwritten notes scattered throughout the file. Most consisted of routine observations, but a few stood out. One investigator wrote, "Pattern exists. Cause unknown." Another simply wrote, "Need explanation for location." Neither investigator ever found one. Eventually, the case reached the same destination as countless others: storage. The reports remained, the witness statements remained, the radar documentation remained. But the answers never arrived. I interviewed Phil for nearly 2 hours that afternoon. Most of our conversation had nothing to do with UFOs. We discussed flying, New Mexico, military service, retirement. As the interview ended, I asked him whether he thought anybody would ever solve the case. He looked toward a framed photograph hanging on the wall behind his desk, and then he shrugged and said, I doubt it. After decades of investigation, the White Sands file remained exactly what it had always been: a collection of reports, a handful of observations, several witnesses, and one recurring image: a dark oval shape suspended above an empty stretch of New Mexico desert. Story 4. Now, the fourth report was maybe the strangest file I ever reviewed. Not because it contained the strongest evidence, or because investigators reached an extraordinary conclusion. Quite the opposite. The reason the case remained controversial was because nobody could determine whether the central event had happened at all. Some investigators considered it one of the most compelling reports in the archive. Others believed the entire thing was a misunderstanding that grew larger every time it was retold. Even today, I don't know which side was correct. What I do know is that 4 witnesses told essentially the exact same story, and none of them ever changed it. The report came from a rural property outside Farmington, New Mexico. The primary witnesses were a family of 4. A father named Michael Turner, his wife Lisa, their 17-year-old son Brandon, and their 14-year-old daughter Emily. The original incident occurred in October of 1996. According to every statement in the file, the night began normally. The family had spent the evening at home, no visitors or unusual activity, no storms, nothing that would later stand out during the investigation. The Turners lived in a small ranch-style house surrounded by open land. Their nearest neighbors were several minutes away by vehicle. The property sat among dry fields broken by fencing, dirt roads, and scattered clusters of trees. The house itself contained a basement beneath the main structure, and that detail would become very important later. Shortly before the incident, the family had gone to bed. The father and mother was asleep. Both children were in their bedrooms. Now, according to their statements, the first unusual event occurred at exactly 1 o'clock in the morning. That time appeared in every interview. Exactly 1. And the reason was simple. All 4 witnesses claimed they heard a grandfather clock strike from the living room moments before everything happened. The family specifically remembered the sound because it was immediately followed by a flash. Blinding green, bright enough to illuminate the entire house. Michael Turner compared it to lightning. His wife disagreed. She said lightning fades almost immediately. According to her statement, this light remained visible long enough to flood every room with color. Brandon described looking toward his bedroom window and seeing the entire field outside glowing green. Emily described the walls of her room appearing almost transparent beneath the light. Whatever they experienced, all 4 agreed on one thing. It came from outside. The family rushed to windows, and that was when they reported seeing the figures. Tall, thin, pale gray, perfectly still, just staring toward the house. Michael estimated 4 figures. Lisa said 5. Brandon believed there were at least 6. Nobody could provide an exact count. The light made observation difficult. The distance varied depending on which window each witness used. What remained consistent was their appearance. Every witness described long limbs, narrow shoulders, large heads, and no visible clothing. No visible facial features beyond dark areas where eyes should have been. The figures were reportedly positioned around the property, one near the driveway, several near the tree line, at least one standing close to the rear of the house. As you can imagine, the family became frightened almost immediately. According to the interviews, nobody attempted to go outside. Nobody approached the figures. Instead, Michael instructed everyone to move into the basement, and that decision would become one of the most heavily discussed elements of the investigation. The family descended into the basement and locked the door behind them. Michael later described pushing shelves and storage containers against the entrance. Lisa confirmed that detail, as did both children. Now, the basement itself was unfinished. Concrete walls, exposed pipes, storage boxes, a small utility area. Most importantly, it contained an old landline telephone. According to the reports, Michael attempted to call for help. The line connected, but instead of a dial tone, he heard static. Heavy static. He hung up and tried again. Same result. Several minutes later, Lisa attempted to use the phone, and she reported hearing the same thing. Static. Nothing else. No operator, no connection, just noise. Later, skeptics argue that phone issues are common during stressful situations. Investigators acknowledge that possibility. The problem was that every witness independently mentioned the phone, even the children. Brandon specifically remembered his father trying multiple times. Emily remembered hearing the static herself. The family remained in the basement for the rest of the night. This portion of the report became difficult to verify because there were no outside witnesses. Everything came from the Turners. According to their statements, they occasionally heard sounds above them. Footsteps, movement, scraping noises. At least once, Michael believed something was walking across the floor of his house. His wife agreed. The family remained hidden until sunrise. And that was when the report became famous within investigative circles. At first, Michael believed the sounds had stopped. He removed the barricade, unlocked the basement door, and opened it. And what happened next remains the central mystery of the case. According to every witness, the basement door no longer opened into their house. It opened into a field. Not a damaged or destroyed house, not a burned house, a field. The reports were remarkably consistent about this detail. All four witnesses described standing at the top of the basement stairs and seeing open land where the first floor should have been. Grass and dirt, morning sunlight, nothing else. The house was just gone. Now, at first glance, the story sounds impossible, I know. Investigators recognized that immediately. So did I. Yet the interviews remained strangely consistent. The family eventually exited the basement, and according to their statements, they discovered they were approximately 1 mile from where the house should have been. The basement itself was reportedly the only structure present at their location. Just the basement. Now, the obvious question is whether any of this could be verified, and that's where the case becomes frustrating. The answer is not completely. Investigators interviewed all four witnesses separately. The statements aligned remarkably well. Timelines matched, descriptions matched, key details remained consistent. But physical evidence was limited. No photographs or video existed. No independent witness observed the alleged relocation. The strongest support came from the interviews themselves and the divided investigators. Some argued the family experienced a traumatic event and reconstructed portions of the memory afterward. Others pointed out that memory contamination becomes less likely when multiple witnesses remain consistent over extended periods. Now, the obvious problem with the case was verification. Investigators wanted to revisit the location immediately, but the Turner family refused. According to the follow-up notes, Michael Turner became visibly upset whenever the subject came up. He cooperated with interviews, answered questions, and provided statements. but he refused to return to the property. So did the rest of the family. Every one of them. The reports indicate they gathered what belongings they could recover, sold the property shortly afterward, and moved out of the area as quickly as possible. And that decision frustrated investigators for years. The central claim in the entire case was that the basement and the house had somehow ended up separated by nearly a mile. If that had actually happened, investigators wanted measurements, photographs, surveys, and independent verification. They never got any of it. By the time detailed follow-up efforts were organized, the property had changed hands. The family was gone. The original scene had been altered. And the best evidence investigators had were the statements themselves. One of the final investigators assigned to the case wrote something in the margin of a review document. I remember it because it perfectly summarized the problem. He wrote, "The account is difficult to believe, and equally difficult to dismiss." Story 5. If somebody had described this case to me before I read the reports, I probably would have dismissed it immediately. The incident occurred near the Gulf Coast of Florida in 1989. Unlike most of the reports I reviewed, this one didn't begin with a single witness. It began with 8. That fact was the only reason the file survived as long as it did. The witnesses included fishermen, beachgoers, and 2 employees working at a small marina near the shoreline. None of them knew one another particularly well. Several had never met before the incident. Yet when investigators interviewed them separately, the core story remained surprisingly consistent. According to the reports, the event occurred shortly after sunrise. The beach was relatively quiet. A few people were walking near the water. Several fishermen were preparing boats for the day. One witness described the Gulf as looking almost perfectly calm. Small waves, light wind. The first unusual detail came from a fisherman named Daniel Wade. According to his statement, he noticed something floating several hundred feet offshore. At first he assumed it was debris, and then he realized it was moving. The object appeared metallic, smooth, rounded, not much larger than a beach ball. Daniel estimated it measured roughly 2 to 3 feet across. That estimate became important later because several witnesses independently gave similar dimensions. At first, nobody paid much attention to it. Small objects drift ashore constantly. The situation changed, however, when it reached shallow water. According to multiple statements, the object stopped moving with the waves. Instead, it appeared to move under its own control. Witnesses described it gliding toward shore. One marina employee said it reminded him of a toy boat moving across a swimming pool. The object eventually reached the edge of the beach, and that's when the file became even stranger. According to every witness, something emerged from it. Not one thing, several. The descriptions varied slightly from interview to interview, but the similarities were difficult to ignore. Each witness described small green figures. Not tall, not intimidating. Tiny. Most estimated they stood between 2 and 3 inches tall. The figures reportedly wore little tiny silver suits. That detail appeared in every statement. Bright silver, reflective, almost metallic. Several witnesses described the suits as looking oversized, as though the material hung loosely around the little figures' bodies. The heads appeared larger than normal relative to their size. The limbs appeared thin, and the figures moved quickly. That was another detail repeated throughout the interviews. They moved quickly, nervous, almost frantic. According to the witnesses, the tiny figures exited the object and began moving along the beach. One report estimated the group contained 4 individuals. Another estimated 6. Most placed it somewhere between 4 and 7. The figures remained visible for less than a minute, and during that time, multiple witnesses reported hearing them vocalize. This became one of the strangest sections of the file. The sounds were described as language. Actual language. They were talking quickly to each other and looked, as one witness said, very stressed out. Several witnesses compared it to people speaking extremely quickly in an unfamiliar foreign language. One fisherman said it sounded like dozens of short words strung together without pauses. Another described it as a conversation occurring at double speed. Nobody recognized any of it. No witness identified a known language. Yet multiple people independently described hearing the same thing. The tiny figures reportedly moved up the beach while speaking among themselves. And then something happened. One of them appeared to notice the witnesses, and that moment appears in nearly every statement. The tiny group stopped, turned, and looked toward the humans watching from the shoreline. The tiny figures appeared startled, like animals realizing they'd been spotted. According to the reports, everything changed immediately afterward. The figures began running back toward the water, fast, very fast. Witnesses described them running across the sand in a way that seemed awkward but incredibly quick. One marina employee compared the movement to frightened birds darting across a parking lot. Within seconds, they reached the shoreline, and the witnesses expected them to disappear into the water, but instead they returned to the object. According to the reports, the small metallic craft remained waiting near the edge of the surf. The tiny figures climbed inside, and the object moved away from shore slowly. Several witnesses claimed it accelerated once it reached deeper waters. Others said there appeared to be something wrong with the craft. The accounts differed regarding the departure, but they agreed on almost everything else. That was what interested investigators. The consistency. 8 witnesses in separate interviews, 8 opportunities for contradictions. Yet the central details remained remarkably stable. Small green figures, silver suits, tiny craft, strange language, rapid retreat. I spent a long time reviewing that file, longer than I probably should have. Investigators examined every obvious explanation: hoax, prank, misidentification, group contamination, faulty memory. They were all considered. None fully explained the witness statements. At the same time, none of the evidence proved anything extraordinary had happened. No photographs existed, no physical evidence was recovered, no recordings existed. Nothing remained beyond witness testimony. And that's where the case stayed, balanced in an uncomfortable place between absurdity and consistency. Now, do I believe little green aliens climbed out of the ocean near Florida and ran across a beach in silver spacesuits? Honestly, I don't know. The story sounds insane. Even talking about it now feels ridiculous. If a single witness had reported it, I would have dismissed it immediately. Maybe 2 witnesses, probably 3. But 8 separate people gave statements. 8 people described essentially the same event. Now, that doesn't prove they were correct. Doesn't prove aliens visited Florida. It doesn't prove anything at all. What it does mean is that something happened on that beach. And exactly what happened remains a mystery. Now, when I retired from this type of work, people occasionally asked me what the strangest report was. I never had a good answer. How do you compare them? A family that never changed their story? Scientists who independently describe the same object? Pilots reporting the same thing across decades? A house that should have been there and wasn't? Tiny little figures running across a Florida beach before disappearing into the Gulf. The reports I've talked about here aren't the only unresolved cases in those archives. Not even close. But for whatever reason, these are some of the top ones I remember. Maybe every one of them has a logical explanation. Maybe someday somebody will find it. Maybe one missing document, one forgotten witness, or one overlooked detail will finally make everything just click into place. Or maybe not. The truth is, those files were old when I first read them. They're even older now. The witnesses are aging. Some are already gone. Investigators retire. Offices close. Records get moved from one building to another. And eventually all that's left are the reports themselves. A stack of paper saying something unusual happened. A stack of paper saying nobody ever figured out why. Somewhere in a storage room, those files are probably still sitting on a shelf. The names, the reports, the interviews, they're all real. Whether the stories are true, whether aliens really do exist, I think I'll let you decide.